As I see it, the main function of my talk today is to provide some broader social context and to think about Damascene interiors from the 18th and 19th century across the population so that we can better, I think, appreciate the Damascus Room here. And what that means is my perspective for the most part is going to be that of the working class population, because most of the city was working class, and actually a substantial minority was much poorer than that, living on the edge of subsistence. And I think if we're trying to understand the sense of grandeur that architecture and decoration would convey, that would necessarily be our starting point. So in the tour of the city that I've worked up here, I wanted to first start with questions of basic architectural design for housing, and then move on to the kinds of objects that were arrayed around interiors. So if we start with housing, as anyone who has ever walked through the old quarters of an Arab town can immediately see, the basic design for a house was the courtyard design. And here the first image I've put up is not exactly a typical courtyard, but of course it conveys, I think, the essential elements. There would be, in such a house, no hallways. We're talking about a suite of rooms around a central courtyard, which would have been equipped with either a fountain or a well. And those choices were, in Damascus, largely dependent on the location of the house within the city. Damascus was blessed with a river, the Barda River, which flows pretty regularly around the year, and the Barda has 6 branches. So certain parts of town were much better served than others, and would have been more likely to have fountains in their courtyards. Now, I think one question which immediately arises whenever you talk about housing and the family life in the interior is privacy. And the courtyard design ensured that there would be a fairly high degree of privacy within each individual room, but the family would have spent a lot of its time in the public space, the courtyard, which was also the scene for a lot of its essential domestic chores. We have then this area which tends to draw the residents of the house out of the rooms. And I should point out too that in many houses, not all houses, there would also be a second floor of rooms, typically along one or two sides of the courtyard, so arrayed in much the same fashion spatially around that central point. So, we can talk about courtyards, but there are still going to be, of course, big differences across the social spectrum. Now, with a wealthy home like this is a 19th century drawing done by a British traveler who was invited into one of the homes and was very much taken with it. And if we think of the homes of notables in an Arab town like Damascus, we would not only find a single courtyard, in many cases there would be multiple courtyards. And so you have to imagine being drawn successively deeper into the house from one from one courtyard to the next. But that, of course, was a privilege of the very wealthy. In most houses, there would only be a single courtyard. And in many other cases, we have families that were condemned to sharing the same courtyard. So when I talk about privacy as being a sort of cultural priority, it's not just the constraints of design and space that we can see in Damascene housing. It also has to do with the fact that urban life was very crowded in 18th and 19th century towns. So with an upper class house, we have lots more space, and this would, of course, accommodate not only the family but an entire retinue of attendants and flunkies who were, in their own way, a mark of social status. I would point out, by the way, briefly in talking about households, that there's a certain myth about Middle Eastern household structure. Most families, or most households, I should say, were not extended multi-generational households. That was really the perquisite of the elite, who had this space to accommodate so many family members and, of course, an extended staff within the same property. The typical household was the nuclear family, parents with their children, and in a typical family that would be roughly 2 to 3 children. So, excuse me, we're really talking about relatively small household units in most cases. Okay, so we have, as one basic fact of urban life, a crowded city. And this is one of the first photographs of Damascus ever taken around 1857. And so, and most of you have wandered through an Arab town before. The old quarters are packed with the winding alleyways and houses that are side by side. This is a sort of cultural choice. People liked the intimacy of neighborhood life. The houses were sharing adjoining walls. And it's going to mean that privacy is there's a sort of trade-off in privacy. From the street level, just wandering around a town, you would not be able to see very much inside because of the high exterior walls precluding any glimpses into the interior of the house. But you can still hear things, you can still hear people talking, and neighborhood life was very, very close, and there was a sacrifice in privacy of information. Neighbors tended to know a lot about each other. Now, inside these very dense quarters, we see that, as I said, the sharing of interiors was fairly common. I wouldn't say it happened in the majority of cases, but with a good number of households, the family did not have the resources to own an entire house by itself. And so we sometimes read in court records arrangements for partitioning the space, sometimes with a curtain. But I think in other cases, people would just get along. They would live together, sharing the same courtyard structure. And in the largest Arab towns from this period, Cairo and Aleppo, we even have references to the equivalent of large apartments, house, it was called, a large structure around a very large central common courtyard in which individual families would have nothing more than a room. So people were very practical about their choices, and if they had to share, so be it. And it was always a worse alternative. We find that some families would actually have to live in public structures like mosques or caravanserais, which was a step down because their privacy was going to be even further compromised, and these were not arrangements that were very family-friendly. So, one of the basic questions then, if we're thinking about how people got along inside cramped housing, is the issue of privacy. And they tried to preserve whatever they could in the way of privacy, but they were resigned to a certain amount of sharing of space, sharing of information. Okay, and here's a pretty typical street scene, and the narrow streets that we all know from wandering through Arab towns. And it's interesting to read court cases from towns like Damascus because we can see these concerns about privacy at work, lawsuits about lines of sight from neighboring courtyards into adjacent properties, and the judge would sometimes order people to stop up windows. Sometimes families, and a further issue would be the expansion of living space. We see that the pragmatism of household life acted as a sort of incentive for people to, if necessary, when they had the means, buy space in adjacent properties, punch holes in walls, and so some houses would actually expand between partitioning walls or even over the head across the street. You can still, wandering around the old quarter in Damascus, find some of these properties where there's a sort of balcony over the street, and at some point in the past the family basically bought a room across the way and connected it. So there's a certain fluidity that also accompanies the domestic culture of the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, if we wander inside and try to understand how people lived with the space that was available to them, often it was a rather limited space, I think one observation we can make is that household routines had a certain seasonal flow. In winter, families would want to spend more time upstairs if they had rooms upstairs, and that's because the upstairs rooms would have been more exposed to the sun. They would have been better heated. Likewise, in summer, they would have had a preference for staying downstairs in rooms that were more shielded from the harsh rays of the sun. So I think there's a certain flow that we can begin to recreate, and the basic rationale for this sort of shifting according to the season is that homes were not well insulated and homes were not well heated. Now, I think it's very easy for us to look at a place like Damascus and shrug off this shortcoming. Oh, well, it's a Mediterranean town, and I'm sure they were warm enough. But the winters, as is true across really the entire Mediterranean, can be a lot chillier and certainly very wet and damp in a way that totally belies the stereotype of a balmy Mediterranean town. So people did have to think about very practical issues like heating, and you can see it even in the way that they had to hold themselves. People, in the course of their daily routines at home, would have remained fully clothed. It was not common, except in the worst heat, to take off clothes. In winter, people would have kept on whatever garments they had because their houses were not well insulated. In fact, they were downright drafty. Now, the main means for heating a house, and this again was one of the major concerns, would be a brazier full of charcoal, or for the poorer households, something like an earthen stove burning whatever people could get their hands on. Wood was scarce and too precious for wide-scale burning, so really we're talking about a town that mainly preferred charcoal as its fuel. And this was further complicated by the vagaries of supply and demand and weather, and in some cases we even have references to artificial shortages due to hoarding. And when all else failed, in order to keep their rooms warm and comfortable, people would simply try to hang drapes in the doorway. In addition to being difficult to heat, Damascene homes were difficult to light. So I actually think it's quite appropriate that the interior is somewhat dim here, because I think that's the way most interiors were in Damascus in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that has to do with the fact that in most homes there weren't a lot of windows. On the ground floor there may have been small slits, and these slits would admit a certain amount of sunlight, but you have to remember that on the ground floor, any windows that were available would have not had much daylight to admit, simply because the streets were not well lit. The houses were close together, and so the rays of the sun did not slant directly down into the streets for the most part. And the glass was of very poor quality. And even Damascenes themselves complained that it was of a rather greenish tint, and it's only around the late 18th century that European glass becomes more frequently imported, and people start to put it in because they recognize that it's made with better techniques and it's more transparent. Large windows, and they're identified in documents with the term shubak, and they're really decorative windows, were reserved for the upper story and were actually quite rare, particularly in the 18th century. And in facing inward, there was a question of security. People did not like opening large apertures on the outside of the house for fear that thieves might enter. And when we think about the windows that were, the large windows, the decorative windows that were on the inside, they were not fitted with glass. They would have iron grills or perhaps wooden grills. Now, there were other kinds of windows, and this is the shrine of Ananias in Bab Sharqi. You can see towards the tops some of the smaller windows that would be cut mainly into the upper stories and sealed with a sort of wooden grill. And people did not typically leave these open. In fact, the whole point of having the wooden grill was to allow the occupants to see out without themselves being seen. Now, when we think about this window design, I think the first point that would become evident is that, well, it allows a lot of circulation of air, which is a good thing in summer, but it would have added to the discomfort of interiors in the winter because it would not have provided much insulation. Now, there were some tricks apparently that people used throughout the Ottoman Middle East. I've heard stories of people sealing windows with bread dough, and then in the spring they would break up the dough and allow the air back in. But I think it's worth thinking about because these interiors were not entirely comfortable places, especially as the temperature dropped. Now, I've been talking about seasonal variations, and I think and the exposure to the elements. I think one other way in which this plays out is that interiors at night were very dark, and Damascenes really had to follow the diurnal schedule. There was no street lighting around town. The first gas lamps don't appear really until the late 19th century, and in fact, in Arab towns, it's only around the 1880s and 1890s, first in Beirut and then slowly elsewhere, at least in Bilad al-Sham, that we start getting attempts at regular street lighting. Prior to that, illumination would be common only during public holidays like Ramadan, when the markets would be kept open late and lanterns would be hung. Aside from these public celebrations, mosques were the only places where nocturnal illumination was regular. In their pious foundations, funds would be set aside for the hanging of lanterns, which would burn olive oil or in some cases simply hold a candle. So we're not talking about a very sophisticated kind of illumination. Now, if we come back to private households, I think all these distinctions amongst lanterns and the different grades of quality that we could find among them are largely irrelevant because lanterns were a very uncommon possession. Most people had to make do with candles, which, besides being more affordable, were easily purchased from neighborhood grocers. But you shouldn't imagine rooms that are lined with candles at night. Damascenes really could not have carried on regular routines after dark. And in fact, if you go through inventories, what you find is that it's very rare in an individual household to find more than 2 or 3 candlesticks at most. So Damascenes really did submit to the darkness. And we hear references sometimes to people staying up late, but they would have done so probably during the warm weather, and they would have simply carried on in the darkness. And we know, and it's common even today for people to spend time out in the courtyard or go up on the rooftops and sleep there. So where they would get illumination from the moon. Now, one other point that I want to make about Damascene households is that if we think about the relationship of the house to the environment, I think the issue of cleanliness also comes up. And one way of understanding how hard it was to keep a clean household is by paying attention to the flooring. Now, just to go back to this first drawing, you can see a beautiful tiled courtyard, and that's what we're used to seeing today. Even wandering into a fairly standard home in the old quarter today, you're going to find a tiled courtyard. Well, if you go back in time, a fully tiled courtyard was actually an extravagance, and it would automatically place a home among the finest in the city. As court records tell us, in most homes, when there was tiling in the courtyard, it would be sufficient just to cover the area around the fountain. And the rest of the courtyard would be coated with a mixture of lime and ash, which was said to last upwards of 20 years. In the poorest homes, people had to make do with nothing more than packed earth. So I think some of the images that we've grown used to, and you see them certainly in restored houses today, are actually of quite recent provenance. And there's been a certain improvement in material culture that we've lost track of. Stepping back in time, I think we have to recognize, at least for the majority of houses in the city, exactly how rugged everyday living conditions really could be.